Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is meteorologist and Forbes senior contributor, Dr. Marshall Shepard. Dr. Shepard, thanks for coming on.
Well, it's always great to talk to you, Brittany, but usually when I am, that means there's something really bad in the weather going on.
Exactly, and this weekend was no different. Tropical Storm Hilary completely drenched Southern California over the weekend, and you wrote for Forbes 3 must-know messages for the Western U.S. about Hilary. So I do want to break them down, starting with your first point, the relative irrelevance of hurricane category. As you know, Hilary was downgraded once it made landfall in the Los Angeles region, but can you explain this point a little bit for us?
Oh yeah, I saw a lot of coverage and talk about Hurricane Hilary out approaching Southern California, Cat 4 hurricane approaching Southern California. I just thought that was bad messaging because it was never forecasted to be a hurricane when it got to California, or even likely when it made the inland landfall near Mexico. But that wasn't the point. We knew that the rainfall from the storm and the tropical storm that it would become would be the big problem for that area. So I think what that messaging ended up doing is it had people perhaps thinking there were going to be hurricane winds in Los Angeles and San Diego and places like that. That was never the case. But the point, and I think it gets into one of my second or third points as well, we were always mostly concerned about the rainfall that was going to fall. And I think that has been borne out as I'm looking at pictures coming in from Southern California.
I do want to talk about the rainfall in a little bit, but you're saying Cat 4 hurricane hurtling towards the Los Angeles area, that's bad messaging. What do you think the messaging should have been then?
Yeah, I think the messaging should have been that, yes, we have a hurricane in the out over the water, but it is expected to be a tropical storm when it impacts the large population centers of the United States. Don't be concerned about the category or the wind speeds. That's not the threat. Be concerned about how widespread they'll be and how long they'll last. I've been on a mantra for some time now that we need to sort of disengage from sort of focusing too much on category and focus more on impacts. And I would say that even on the East Coast too. So for example, when people in Los Angeles or San Diego hear Category 4 hurricane weakens, I think psychologically they let their guard down, yet the impacts that we were expecting from that storm never changed just because it went from a hurricane to a tropical storm. We always expected terrible rainfall, irrespective of the category.
You've broken this down for our viewers before, but can you explain what the category does mean and how that might be deceiving when it comes to impact?
Yeah, well, the category is based on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is a wind scale. It's an engineering scale. It's based on the wind speeds, and that's related to pressure. Now, that is important. A Category 4, 5, or Category 3 storm, those are major hurricanes, and they can be quite devastating, as we've seen over the years with various Category 5, 4, 3 storms, like perhaps Hurricane Michael and so forth. But the point I want to make is that in places like Los Angeles, it was never going to be a Category 4 storm, but because that region receives so little rainfall, relatively speaking, in a given year, the rainfall impacts were going to be so much more amplified than, say, they would have been anywhere else, just because they're not accustomed to that type of rainfall and don't necessarily have the infrastructure. So the category is certainly meaningful, certainly it should be used. But one of the things that I always convey is it doesn't really tell you much about the rainfall potential in these storms. That's more determined by how slow they're moving, how large they are, and some of the other things that just aren't folded into that category.
One of your other points has to do exactly with rainfall, so let's get to that next. It's water is the most deadly aspect of tropical systems, not winds. Explain.
Yeah, I think this, again, it comes back to this. I think wind is what's the sort of telegenic, sort of sexy thing to present on TV when you see the TV meteorologist standing out there on the beach holding onto a stop sign or something. But we know from numerous studies that water is what kills people in hurricanes and tropical storms, whether that be from storm surge or from the freshwater flooding that comes from the rainfall. I don't think the storm surge was much of an issue in this particular storm out west, although I did see some people riding some pretty gnarly waves out there. But I do think that the rainfall, I saw pictures of people driving through flooded roadways. That's one of the main ways that we lose lives. But again, these people aren't accustomed to that type of flooding. But even here on the East Coast, where I am in Georgia or Florida, or where you are on the East Coast in New York, people still make bad decisions when it comes to water and flooded roadways. So that's why I always emphasize that it's the rain, it's the water in these storms that's most deadly, and yet you can't always ascertain that from the category of the storm. Remember Houston and Hurricane Harvey in 2017, 50 plus inches of rainfall, a devastating storm for Houston, and most of that rain fell while it was a tropical storm. So that's why I'm always sort of put up the cross the neck. No, it's not just the tropical storm. Tropical storms can produce quite a bit of rainfall. Some of my own research here at the University of Georgia has shown that the tropical storms or the weaker storms can be the most prolific rain producers.
To piggyback off your point, Southern California over the past 24 hours has experienced mudslides, flooding, and power outages. So as a meteorologist, what of those three concerns you the most?
Well, I'm always concerned about the flooding, but the most intense rainfall is the 5 to 8 inches that I've seen out in the higher elevation. So that certainly will lead to mudslides and landslides. So certainly people living in those at higher elevation are in danger. But I'm always concerned about flooding because people just let their guard down when it comes to flooding. I think they are, for whatever reason, scared of winds and tornadoes and hurricane winds. They see flooding as something that they can deal with because they understand rain. And so if there are flooded roadways, and I imagine there are this Monday here in Southern California and in some other parts of the desert Southwest, I just hope that people are taking that seriously. You didn't mention, but I'll mention it. There was also an earthquake in that region as well, and some of us are speculating that maybe the lubrication from all of that rainfall could have sort of triggered some aspects of that. Now, we can't say that conclusively. In fact, it would be irresponsible to say so, but there are studies that do show evidence that a lot of rainfall can trigger earthquakes in places like China or California. But again, that's very speculative at this point. But to get back to your question, I'm most concerned with this particular storm about people going out too early, maybe trying to drive through flooded roadways. I mean, I think most of the rain has ended in that region, but it will be a day or so before people can kind of get back to normal. I saw some pretty awe-inspiring pictures, Brittany. I don't know if you've seen these, of Dodger Stadium underwater, or most of it underwater, in the surrounding parking lots and everything.
I know the raining there is just monstrous, but I do want to get back to the earthquake that Southern California did experience during that flood. So are you saying, or what evidence suggests that this was more of a freak accident, or is this a chain reaction?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, and I can't say anything specifically about the relationship between the rainfall and this particular earthquake, but I did use it as a teachable moment to write in Forbes, showing that there are several studies in the scientific literature that have linked earthquakes to heavy rainfall. Again, I am not saying here on the Forbes broadcast that this tropical storm caused that earthquake. That is not what I'm saying at all. But I am showing that there is scientific plausibility in the literature that heavy rain events can trigger earthquakes. And so I think people over time will continue to look at that study. So I just wanted to use that as a teachable moment. But it certainly was a unique day, Brittany, to look on a weather map and see a tropical storm sitting over Los Angeles and an earthquake. That's just I'm pretty sure people's alert systems are going off for various reasons in that region. And by the way, if you're listening or watching this, please make sure you have your wireless emergency alert system enabled on your cell phones. That's very important. Oftentimes people do disable those, and in a time like that, yesterday in Southern California, it was very important to have that on.
Dr. Shepard, I always appreciate your teachable moments. I feel like every time you come and talk to me, you at least drop quite a few teachable moments. But I want to talk about the third point in your article, and that's impacts are not dots or lines on a map. Can you break that down for us?
I can, and I often, preach this even when storms are approaching the eastern coast as well. That cone of uncertainty, that cone that you often see presented on the internet or on your local television show or the Weather Channel, it shows sort of this cone that the hurricane path is likely to take. And oftentimes people mistakenly just focus in on the line down the center of that cone, or those little dots down the center of the cone, and say, oh, well, that's where the impacts are going to be. No, these storms aren't dots or lines. They're actually large systems, cover hundreds of miles in some cases. And so when you see that cone, what that cone actually means is there's about a 66% chance that the center of the storm can be anywhere in that cone. It's probabilistic. It's not deterministic. It's not just a line. And so, it's just something, even though the storm was sitting over at one point last night, I think over Los Angeles, the rain was extending well out into the east of Los Angeles and perhaps even as far east as Las Vegas. And so it's just important to understand what the cone actually means, and that those impacts are not just in the center of that cone.
This was Southern California's first tropical storm in more than 8 decades. So is this a once-in-a-lifetime storm, or should residents in this region really brace for this type of incident to happen more frequently?
Well, yeah, I wrote about this in a previous Forbes article. There was another storm that made landfall in 1939. Some call it the Long Beach storm, tropical storm. There have been other storms, tropical storms, that have impacted the region but did not make landfall or have as direct an impact as these two storms that we're talking about. Climate change is real. I write about climate change all the time. We know it's happening and it's affecting our weather. I'm not ready to sort of pin this to climate change per se, because we have seen storms in that region before. But I will say that much of the oceans, whether they're in the Pacific or the Atlantic, Brittany, have been anomalously warm this year due to climate change, due to El Nino and some other things. And in fact, even as you and I are speaking right now, the Atlantic hurricanes are really ramping up. There are 4 or 5 systems that we are watching right now in the Atlantic Ocean. I think there are a couple of named storms already, and I think we're about to get another named storm in the Gulf of Mexico that will likely make landfall in southern Texas or even Mexico. So I may be writing something on that in the coming hours or days, because the Atlantic hurricane basin is quite active right now and right on cue. It's mid to late August. The peak of the hurricane center season is around the second week of September. So we usually do see a ramp up in late August, and right on cue we're seeing it. And NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has projected an above normal hurricane season in the Atlantic. So we got to, it's kind of an anomaly to be watching a hurricane or a tropical storm in California, but now we've turned our eye to where we usually expect them, and it's quite active.
Well, when that happens, I do hope you come on and break those storms down for us. But in the meantime, what should California residents do who might not be used to this type of rainfall, because this is a once every few decades incident?
Yeah, that's right. It is a sort of the recurrence interval on these things is fairly low. Whether we'll start to see more of these types of events in that region remains to be seen. I am concerned about warming sea surface temperatures over time, but again, it's a little too early to make such connections. But it's just important for California residents, people in the Southwest, to monitor their local authorities. Make sure you follow your local National Weather Service office. Every region, every area has a National Weather Service office, and they put out alerts and information that's quite useful. You can't rely on your phone app in these types of situations. You've got to get detailed information from more expert sources in these high impact, rapidly evolving scenarios. So make sure you understand what your National Weather Service office is, who it is, find them on social media. Also have emergency kits in place, and have what I call the night plan. Always before you go to bed, have a good understanding of what the weather scenario is where you are. And that's good advice in any type of weather situation, not just these tropical ones.
Well, I appreciate that, Dr. Marshall Shepard, per usual. I really appreciate you coming on. Even though when you do come on, like you said earlier, it's not usually a good time, I appreciate the insight you provide to the viewers.
No, it's off. Thank you for having me, and it's important to convey this information, because we'll face these things again, and so I'm happy to have the platform, if you allow it, to educate people on some of these topics. And some of it is just gee whiz. I'm a weather geek, and so some of this is just wow. A tropical storm in California. I mean, that's worth talking about. So hopefully no one was hurt, and we can learn from this as we move forward.
Absolutely. Thanks again.